rose even further when the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor. This was precisely the sort of thing that Wilson had been predicting. Unless the nations of the world can join together to warn off the aggressors will pick us apart one by one. And by December of 1941 through 1945, the end of the war, Wilson began to be acclaimed as the most visionary of American presidents. And from being a historical nobody, Wilson became one of the greatest American presidents. And when Franklin Roosevelt, at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, got the agreement of Britain and the Soviet Union to the creation of the United Nations organization and committed the United States to the principle that the American people would accept responsibility for the future of the world, Woodrow Wilson had become vindicated. And at that point, and frankly, I would argue, until now, every American president has been a proud Wilsonian. The essence of Wilsonianism is that the United States owes the world and owes itself responsibility for international order and world peace. If the United States doesn't do it, no one else will. You can look at Franklin Roosevelt first, follow with Harry Truman, and on down to George W. Bush. George W. Bush might be described as initially a reluctant Wilsonian. In the campaign of 2000, George W. Bush said, "We don't go in for nation building." And he paid little heed to foreign affairs in that election campaign. But after 9/11, George W. Bush became not simply a committed Wilsonian, but one could argue a radical Wilsonian, a militant Wilsonian. Wilson had said the United States must go to war in 1917 to make the world safe for democracy. Safe for democracy, he said. He didn't say to make the world democratic. But what is the argument of the Bush administration today for the American occupation of Iraq? It's to bring democracy to Iraq. President Bush has taken Wilson one step further. The United States isn't simply going to make the world safe for existing democracies. The United States is going to create more democracies around the world. And so Wilson, I won't say that I probably claimed too much at the beginning when I said that presidents and presidential reputations are at the mercy of historians. They're at the mercy of historians, but they're also at the mercy of subsequent events. It wasn't just us historians who revived the reputation of Woodrow Wilson. It was the nature of world events. But the fact is that Wilson now is considered one of the great presidents of all time. I was going to talk about Harry Truman and how Harry Truman was even more unpopular than Woodrow Wilson when he left office. But historians, and history, have revived the reputation of Harry Truman. So what's going on here? I said that, we historians can rewrite history, or Samuel Butler or somebody said that we historians can rewrite history only up to a point. In fact, if we don't make it up, we make it accord with changing times. We historians are as much creatures of our times as politicians are. And when the world turned out to be as Woodrow Wilson had predicted it would be, then the historians fell into line. Even historians in the 1950s thought that Harry Truman was a disaster as president. He couldn't even get the nomination of his own party in 1952. But as it became apparent that, and the real crux of the complaint against Truman was the Korean War, which in 1952 was this bloody conflict that seemed to have no end. But when the Korean War turned out to be a model of success in the Cold War, and things are always judged by what happens later. The Korean War didn't seem successful in 1952 or even 1960. But when the Vietnam War came along, then President Johnson and President Nixon dearly hoped for a Korea-style outcome in Vietnam, where half of the country might remain divided, but our half of the country is secure. And today, South Korea is a brilliant success story, and Americans can pat themselves on the back for their role in helping that come about. Now, I suppose, and as a result of that, Harry Truman is seen as something of a visionary. In response to a question yesterday morning, I was asked, well, how would I assess George W. Bush? And my first reaction was to say it's too soon to tell. And of course, it really is too soon to tell. But George W. Bush is hoping that he will be viewed as a Harry Truman, who got America engaged in this unpopular war that didn't go well at first. But over time, the Korean War is seen as a model of success, and therefore Harry Truman as a visionary who saw this before other Americans did. So this is one scenario for the future reputation of George W. Bush. The other scenario, well, I'll tell you a different scenario, and you decide whether it's really a different scenario, is that George W. Bush might wind up looking like Lyndon Johnson, who led the United States into another elective war, the war in Vietnam, and the war turned out badly. And so George W. Bush may be branded as the president who led us into the quagmire of Iraq. Well, we don't know how it's going to turn out. And frankly, we don't really know how the Vietnam War is going to turn out. Because the United States lost the war in Vietnam, but Vietnam is looking better now than it has in years past. So it might turn out that the war in Vietnam wasn't as big a deal as the American people thought. Maybe it was a really big deal for the United States. And it was a pretty big deal for Vietnam, but was it a big deal for the rest of the world? Well, anyway, how will all this stuff be viewed by history, by historians? Here I get to fall back, and I said this to some of you who were in an earlier lecture. Forgive me for repeating myself, but it is worth repeating. Edward Gibbon was the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The first volume was published in 1776. Oh, I got to tell you something about 1776, and I will get to the punchline and end this. But see, we historians are always looking for hooks to tell the history of, well, we historians of the United States tell the history of the United States. And it has long occurred to me that there is a wonderful juxtaposition in history. Two documents that would change the world were published within months of each other in the year 1776. One of these was the American Declaration of Independence. This is the manifesto of American equality and what will become American democracy. The other major publication was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which became the blueprint for American and other countries' capitalism, free market economics. And at various times I've tried to explain the development of American history as the playing out of the themes of these two charters from 1776. Because the two institutions that characterize the United States, that make American society what it is today, are democracy and capitalism. And so they all go back to 1776. Now, there is this third book that comes out in 1776, and this is volume 1 of Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And if I could figure out, and I'll be happy for your help on this one, if I can figure out a way of tying this one in, boy, it would be a great trifecta. Everything dates to 1776. Anyway, in conclusion, I will say what Edward Gibbon said. When asked, this book, 1776, it's talking about events that had happened 1,500 years earlier, a millennium and a half earlier. He was asked, Mr. Gibbon, what do you see as the lasting significance of the Roman Empire? And Gibbon, speaking like a true historian, said, it's too soon to tell. Thank you very much. And we've got time, I think, a little time for questions.